Hey everyone, welcome to Christ is the Cure. We are continuing our summer guest series with two hosts of a great podcast. And man, I was just telling them that I mispronounce it, and I have in previous episodes. In fact, I don't even know if I'm going to try to say it right now. I'll let them introduce themselves. So it's Ben and Vin from, yes. And they are classical Arminians. Would y'all categorize that as the correct terminology?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're classical Arminians. I guess more specifically, we're Wesleyan Arminians.
Wesleyan Arminians. Okay, so we'll get into the weeds of that going through this podcast. So I guess before we start, would you all care to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm Vin, and Ben and I host the podcast together. I'm actually I'm bivocational. So I'm a pastor of a growing church plant, and I'm also a high school history teacher as well. I'm actually in my last class of my last semester of seminary. I'll be graduating in May, or at least finishing in May. I don't know when graduation is going to be with the whole pandemic going on, but I'll be finishing up my last class in May. I'm over at Wesley Seminary in Indiana.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I'm Ben. I serve bivocationally with Vin at the same church plant up here in Connecticut, which we've been doing that for a few years now. So I'm a pastor there, and then by day I work in schools as well, but in different capacity. I'm not a teacher. I feed students. I've worked in the culinary industry for about 20 or so years. And so I am actually the food service director for a school district. So I serve about 6,000 meals every day. I have 53 or so employees that I'm responsible for. So my running gag is that my job during the day is also very pastoral, because I spend most of my time dealing with, problems and issues and questions and fights between people that come up. So, and then, I'm also finishing school right now. I'm finishing actually a bachelor's in pastoral ministry, at Oklahoma Wesleyan myself. So.
That's awesome. Yeah, so all three of us are in school still. I'm currently at Talbot. I'm getting my master's in New Testament studies. So
nice,
very cool. So I guess getting right into it, what do you think are the biggest points of disagreement between Calvinists and Arminians? Or in fact, let's back up a step. Would you care to define Arminian and start from that point?
Yeah, historically, Arminianism originates in the theology of the Dutch theologian Jacob Arminius. He died in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, and essentially, Arminius was a pastor and a theologian within the Dutch Reformed Church, and he differed from his contemporaries, particularly in regards to issues relating to supralapsarian Calvinism, and essentially out of his ideas, which he saw as an alternative understanding of Reformed theology, arose what we call Arminianism today.
Okay, so. From y'all's vantage point and from his vantage point, it was another branch of Reformed theology. Would you say that's accurate? Oh, okay. I didn't know if you were going to say something. Yeah. So from there, there's obviously a lot of places where Calvinists and Arminians kind of get into it. Where would you say is actually like the biggest point of contention between the two viewpoints?
Anybody want to jump on this one?
Sure. So, if there is a differential point, it's, just in regards to limited atonement and irresistible grace. There's maybe a lot of other ones that are brought up, but, I guess we'll kind of discuss as we go along. Like we don't, as classical Arminian and Wesleyan Arminians, we don't disagree with total depravity, things like that. The point that Arminius himself broke with, his contemporaries on was just those issues in regards to, predestination, things like that. Otherwise, he was, fully ascribed to, what Reformed teaching taught.
Yeah. And I think that's important for everyone listening, that total depravity is affirmed and that the disagreements on the atonement, and then I guess we'll get into whether or not grace is resistible or irresistible.
Right.
Yeah, I guess one other thing I would add too, in regards to the story of Arminius, is that he was working in a pre-Synod of Dort situation, so that the Synod of Dort had not happened yet, and it wouldn't convene until about 10 years after his death. So when as you know, in the late 1500s and the early 1600s, there were a large variety of Reformed theologians that didn't see eye to eye on everything.
Absolutely.
And Arminius saw himself among the Reformed options, both, especially on the European continent and then also in England. And he didn't particularly see himself as non-reformed until, obviously, when the Synod of Dort takes place about 10 years after his death. There's a stricter orthodoxy of Reformed thought that's established there, and then therefore, I guess retroactively, Arminius is not then therefore seen as a Reformed option at all. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's still worth noting today, too, that those who kind of claim exclusive titles to Reformed theology, Calvinists, they don't see eye to eye on everything. You have those who hold to limited atonement, those who don't, and different views of how the fall occurred and all that. And I think that's an important point where we're talking about this kind of thing. So your podcast on the About page says that you seek to inform people about Wesleyan Arminian theology and address misrepresentations. So what are the ones that you see most often, and how would you correct those misrepresentations?
Yeah, I'll do one. I mean, one of them I think I would say is that Wesleyan Arminianism is very different from Calvinism, because it's really not. I mean, in a lot of ways, the theology of Arminius and the theology of Wesley, at least rightly understood, is a legitimate heir of Reformation theology. In a lot of ways, Arminianism and Wesleyanism were extensions of Reformed theology, although differing from Reformed theology in some significant ways, which we will talk about. But I mean, Arminius himself recommended the writings of Calvin, the commentaries of Calvin. Wesley is very famous for saying numerous times that his theology is within a hair's breadth of Calvinism. That's a quote that he repeated numerous times in his correspondence with other Calvinist evangelicals of his time, like John Newton or George Whitefield. And then also, even Wesley in his sermon, The Lord Our Righteousness, specifically says that he understands the doctrine of justification in the same way that John Calvin. So you can see that there are a lot of similarities. I mean, there are significant differences as well. But I think overall, I think when people think of Arminianism or Wesleyanism, or Wesleyan Arminianism anyway, they think that it's the exact opposite of Calvinism, right, or the opposite of Reformed theology. But I mean, I would argue that as Wesleyan Arminians, we have more in common with our Reformed brothers than we would other Christian Protestant traditions. For example, Lutheranism. I think Calvinists and Wesleyan Arminians actually have more in common theologically than we would with Lutherans. So that I think that would be one misunderstanding or misconception.
Yeah, that's a good point. I could add, is one we commonly bring up on the podcast is just in regards to matters of the will, being as that's kind of the thing that's level. If someone says they're Arminian, then that's usually like the first thing. Oh, well, you believe that you have free will, and we think it's important to differentiate between free will and a freed will, with that important little D on the end there, only because it's it's taken in the way that, people choose. Like, what does it mean to choose, right? And, we don't prefer that kind of terminology that, because it's, that's giving a much more like an anthropocentric understanding of, salvation and God's work and things like that. And when you talk about like a free will, that falls under that same kind of, wording or phrasing or understanding. Whereas if you're talking about someone that has a freed will, it's pointing us back to the fact that it's God, right? God has awakened that will, or God has, worked in this person, preveniently, like through, by his grace to, awaken them to salvation, and we just see that as an important differentiation to make, mostly because people within our own camps, oftentimes are the ones that have those words the most kind of jumbled together, and it's very much, and it misrepresents, the classical theological stance that we would take, like I said, within our own circles.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you saying that too. And that kind of segues into the next question, I guess, was whenever it comes to the human will prior to prevenient grace or regeneration, whenever I was looking into, Arminius's work on providence and the human will, I didn't really see much difference between Calvinistic compatibilism and Arminianism. And so I guess, could you speak to that? Is there actually a distinction there, or is it essentially the same, just different terminology or how it's expressed, or what do you think is going on there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the difference would really come between compatibilism and classical Arminianism. I think it would really come down to the understanding of humans prior to prevenient grace would be the same, because, as Ben was saying before, Wesleyans, at least people who hold to Orthodox Wesleyan Arminian teaching, would strongly affirm total depravity, that prior to grace we are dead in our trespasses and sins, and in our own strength there's nothing that we can do to come out of that condition. So in that way we would be the same as compatibilists. The difference would the primary difference would be prevenient grace, which is God's grace before regeneration. From the Western Arminian understanding, we believe that grace can be resisted, where essentially the choice that you have is either to resist the grace of God or surrender to God's grace that's working. Like a really good analogy that Roger Olson presents in his book Arminian Theology, Myths and Realities is that we are basically unconscious at the bottom of a well. We're dead. There's really nothing that we can do. But then someone calls our name, wakes us up, and then begins to pour water into the well, and basically says, "Just allow yourself to float to the top." And the only he's basically saying the only choice you have is either let the water carry you to the top of the well or hold on to the bottom and drown. And that's essentially like the choice that we have in salvation, is like our wills are awakened by the grace of God. As Ben said, we don't have a free will, we have a freed will. And therefore, really our only choice is whether or not we're going to resist the grace of God or surrender to it, float to the top or hold on to the bottom of the well. So, I mean, I think that would be the difference, though, is that we do believe that you can resist it, whereas our Calvinist brothers would say that the grace of God works irresistibly.
Yeah, so I was particularly interested in that question because in regards to like the Old Testament, whenever you're talking about the human will, it seems like in my discussion with people that probably would not be considered, I guess, classical or more orthodox Arminian, whenever I look back in hindsight, but the linchpin or the argument is that, well, we have the will to make choices. And for me, it's like, well, that's not a contention really. And so I don't know how you guys respond to that whenever someone may say that to you or someone brings that up in dialogue. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you mean your when the conversations you had, they said that they'll just say, well, we could all make choices. Yeah, because I mean, as a compatibilist, you'd say that we have the freedom to make choices, but our choices are only going to be choices for evil, right? In accordance with our nature.
Right. That the will moves in accordance with your nature. Yeah. So, I mean, y'all would essentially affirm that because of total depravity, correct?
Yeah, correct. And then, but then obviously, if we are going to make choices against our nature, it would only be those that are enabled by the prevenient grace of God. But I think the difference, though, between us and combatibilism would be that we would say, though, at that point that you can resist the grace of God. You can resist God's prevenient grace, whereas combatibilists would say, would affirm irresistible grace. But one thing I will say, though, is even John Wesley believed that at the moment of regeneration, the grace of God is irresistible. And he affirmed that in numerous writings, a famous letter to George Whitefield and another writing as well. There's two places in Wesley's writings that he says that specific thing, that at the moment of regeneration, God's grace works irresistibly, but the individual can resist the grace of God before that moment.
So just to clarify, you have prevenient grace that enables the individual to surrender, as you were saying, but once they surrender, that regeneration is irresistible. Is that correct? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, the exact moment of regeneration, God worked irresistibly.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah,
but you can resist the grace of God leading up to that point.
Okay, I've heard, I believe it was Roger Olson in his book. I read Arminian's Myths. I can't remember what it's called, the full title. But he called it prevenient grace, partial regeneration. Do you guys agree with that terminology, just out of curiosity?
I would not. I would not say that prevenient grace is partial regeneration.
Okay,
right.
I just thought that was an interesting term, so I was just wanting to throw that one out there.
Yeah. There's always nuance in the terminology in the world, but
definitions.
Regeneration has to be regeneration.
Okay, that's good. That's good clarification. I enjoyed that. So we kind of touched on it a little bit, because if individuals don't recognize what semi-Pelagianism is and all that, then they obviously wouldn't see what we've already discussed. Refutes the idea that you guys are semi-Pelagian. You guys probably hear that a lot. What is your initial response? Just, we affirm that, and I guess, how do you address that whenever it comes up in a topic? Because it seems like in most cases, a Calvinist assumes that if you're not Calvinist, you're an Arminian, which opens up the door for a lot of misconceptions. And so how does that come up, and how do you address it?
Anybody want to jump on that one?
Sure. So how do we address like someone saying that we're semi-Pelagian?
Yeah.
I think we would just go back to the explanation like that Vin was just giving in regards to our views on depravity, and our views on, God's work of, God's saving work in a person's life. Because at the heart of saying that we're semi-Pelagian is saying that, it's based in that idea that we choose and then God responds to our choosing. And so, we are doing all of these things based on on the moving of our own ability, our own human will. And, as people who affirm classical Arminian teaching, we would say that, we would point back to the fact that God is the initiator in salvation. Man does not choose when he's going to be saved. It's God's grace that essentially is saying, today's the day. You can either resist this, the moving of my grace in your life, or you can, to use the, Olson's analogy, you can, flow with the water, or you can kick against it. But, it's God is the initiator of salvation. God chooses the moment. God provides the grace. God gives faith. God pours into our life in that moment. We are not, we're not choosing that I'm going to be saved today, which is, we hear that common language a lot, even in people that we pastor, but only because they don't necessarily understand what's happening in that moment, which is fine. Most people just out of ignorance are going to say, today I responded to the gospel, because they don't understand that there was something, God was working in your life in months and years and weeks previously, that were leading you to that point. God was preparing you for that moment, and then God poured into your life in that moment so that you could respond positively, or you can comply with, right, his call to salvation in your life. So we would just, we would point back to those general realities that it's God's the initiator, God works, God leads. Man's not, we're not choosing to be saved of our own will and strength.
Love it. If I can ask a clarifying question on the topic of prevenient grace, then is in terms of how prevenient grace is, I don't know if executed is the proper word. What is the means of prevenient grace? I've heard it said it's the gospel preached. I've heard it said it's just the cross in general. I've heard different views on it. So I guess what is y'all's particular case, or what is the classical position on it?
Yeah, well, when it comes to prevenient grace, as Ben was just saying, I think I think what you're getting at before with Olson's idea about like partial regeneration. I think people think that it's just this blanket grace that just goes out, and then at any moment people could just respond to the gospel and be saved and basically choose themselves when that's going to happen. That's not the way that Arminius nor Wesley articulated their understanding of prevenient grace. Typically, when you look at prevenient grace, the channels through which it's conveyed to the individual is through the means of grace, which would be prayer, God's word, even elements of general revelation as well, the creation or the conscience, those things which are all enabled by prevenient grace. But then once again, those would really be the channels through which God conveys His prevenient grace, would be through those means. It's not just like this blanket ability that everyone has at all times, and like Ben was saying too. I mean, there's a famous quote where Wesley actually says this numerous times too. He says that an individual will be saved if they will, but not when they will. So essentially, the grace of God prepares the person to receive the gospel. But even as someone is receiving the grace, the prevenient grace of God through those various means of grace that it's being made available, that doesn't mean that they're going to pick the exact moment that they're going to be saved, because once again, God does work irresistibly at the moment of regeneration. So.
Yeah, I'm glad that you explained that, because I have to admit that whenever I was first learning through it, I was like, well, so is prevenient grace something that was just at the cross and therefore it's applied to all of humanity? Because I think there's a view that holds to that, but I don't think it's y'all's view. I don't want to put a label on it right now. So I really appreciate that clarification, that's for sure. So oftentimes, whenever we come to talk about this between synergism and monergism kind of thing, in light of that, if someone says, you guys reject sola fide because of your position, which I'm sure you hear, how do you respond to that? And we'll get into the follow-up after that.
Yeah, Ben, you want to get this one?
Sure. So, we would just politely disagree that we do affirm faith is the gift of God. Again, our understanding of prevenient grace leads us into that, right? It's the grace of God awakening us. It's God giving us faith. Obviously there's general or like common faith that all people have, but saving faith comes from God. It's not something that we have within us, and it's not something that we can like stir up or anything. It comes from God. And so, we do, as classical Wesleyan Arminians, we heartily affirm all five solas, and that faith is a gift of God.
Yeah, I really appreciate that one too, because again, it's one of those things where, well, you guys don't believe that faith is a gift; it's something that comes from the person. So how do you, one of those situations? Right. So I guess the follow up is, and I'm personally curious about this: do you guys hold to a form of eternal security? And if so, how does that all play together?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because we do affirm all of the sola. So I mean, sola gratia. We're saved by grace through faith. We're saved in Christ, sola Christus, Christ alone. Really, what it comes down to is we don't believe in eternal security, at least in the common understanding of what the term means today. We do believe, though, that the individual is eternally secure in Christ. But if you're outside of Christ, you are not eternally secure. So essentially, our security is based on union with Christ, and union with Christ is through faith. Mm-hmm. Now, there are some Arminians or people who claim to be Arminians that will say that essentially, like if there's certain sin that you do, and as soon as you do that sin, then you're immediately not then you lose your salvation. Our reading of Arminius and Wesley, it seems to point to the fact that sin is really the fruit of a loss of faith and a loss of union with Christ. So we would go back to saying that essentially our security is found through union with Christ through faith, just like what Jesus talks about in John 15 about abiding in the vine. And then as the branches are abiding in the vine, they will bear much fruit. Jesus says, without me, you can do nothing. But what does he say about the branches that are not abiding in the vine, that they will wither and die? So that's really our understanding of eternal security, is that we believe that you are eternally secure through union with Christ. But if you are no longer in union with Christ, if you renounce faith in Christ, like what the writer to the Hebrews warns about, then you will no longer be you will no longer be secure. Does that kind of make sense? We can keep talking about that if you have any follow-up questions.
Yeah. So for clarification's sake, it's not any sin that you do that makes you lose salvation. It's just apostatizing from Christ himself that makes you lose salvation, right?
Yeah. And then sin would be the fruit, persistent willful sin would essentially be the fruit of a loss of that union with Christ, if that makes sense. So just like Jesus says, a tree by its fruit. So, if abiding in the vine, like Jesus says in John 15, if you abide in the vine, you're going to bear good fruit. If you're no longer abiding in the vine, then you're going to bear bad fruit.
So, okay.
Or no fruit.
This may be kind of an off the cuff question then. Could an individual bear bad fruit, think that they're abiding in Christ, but not be in that position? I'm just curious. That's kind of like theological speculation at that point, I know, but I just have to pick your brains on that one.
I'd say you could, like, you can have a false, you can have a false impression that you're a Christian when you're not. Yeah, definitely. I don't know. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, for sure. I think the analogy, the reality of the fruit kind of, you can bear bad fruit, and bad fruit is just a sign of what your heart is. But, you can think something besides that, if you should decide to. I think kind of the important piece of that is just like that, not affirming like this in again, out again, like a daily, I can go through my day and be a Christian for, 12 hours of the day and the other 12 not be, like that just creates a lot of confusion, anxiety, and, unneeded pressure on people. Like we don't affirm any, I would just call them their classic Finneyisms. That was like a Charles Finney kind of thing. But we don't affirm those kinds of things now.
I think that's a pretty important clarification too for a lot of listeners, because it's kind of that idea like, well, you wake up and you didn't do things right, so there you go, you're off the branch. Oh wait, now you're back on the branch, kind of thing.
Yeah. So, it's a very, I remember, and again, like when I was a young Christian, like I grew up in kind of like your classic like non-denominational, charismatic environment. Didn't really have a theological understanding of anything, and in my early 20s, after just years of doing my own thing, and just coming kind of back into a church environment and starting to learn like that, I remember walking with that anxiety all the time, fearful that, a wrong thought or I admit, when I was young, I had a pretty short fuse, sometimes I still do, but, but I was always fearful, like, in an angry moment, am I losing my salvation because I just blew up on my boss, or I just yelled at my neighbor, or the guy that cut me off on the highway. And, I remember having a lot of pressure and fear, but then learning, right, like, learning differently and having an understanding of God's grace, how God's grace is actually working, what salvation is really working in me, and God's patience with people, and then having just an understanding theologically of what that looks like was a tremendous relief. Yeah. To not think that I can potentially, because of one wrong mistake today, I can lose my salvation, and fall from my faith because of, some, whatever, because I had a bad moment, or, I ate something that disagreed with my stomach and I'm in a bad mood now because of it. It's life-changing to realize that.
Yeah. I think a lot of people can relate to that. I know I can. I was going through that kind of anxiety phase myself. And for some reason, I thought it was a good idea to listen to Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Man, I was just like done for the rest of the day. I could not handle it. Yeah. So that was a good explanation. Yeah, for sure.
One thing I'll add to that too is one of our favorite Arminian historical theologians is Keith Stanglin, and he talks about how you have to watch out for the extremes of he said classical Arminianism bewares of both the extremes of once saved always saved and once saved barely saved.
Yeah.
So to be like once saved always saved is the belief that no matter what which I think in a lot of ways is even different than perseverance of the saints, but which is basically the belief that no matter what you do, you can't lose your salvation. And then the other extreme would be once saved barely saved, which is what Ben's describing there, that you feel like you're always walking on eggshells because you could be a Christian in the morning and lose your salvation at lunch, and then you can be a Christian again before you go to bed at night. Which both of those extremes could lead to an unhealthy understanding of the Christian walk.
Yeah, that's a great explanation too. I think that captures the balance that's kind of necessary no matter who you are. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So on your page, you mentioned heretical spinoffs, and since Calvinists label everyone as Arminians, and we want kind of clarification of how to distinguish you guys from the spinoffs. Well, what are some of the predominant ones, and I guess how would you discuss those?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, because you asked before about semi-Pelagianism. Now, I one of my professors at seminary, Dr. Chris Bounds, wrote a really helpful article where he talks about how there's a spectrum of salvation. There's Pelagianism, semi-Pelagianism, semi-Augustinianism, and then Augustinianism. Classical Wesleyan Arminianism is semi-Augustinian, which is essentially as what Ben and I have been describing, that that God is the initiator of salvation, that the work of salvation is by the grace of God alone. Yet a person who's been awakened by grace could either resist it or surrender to its work. But unfortunately, a lot of the heretical spin-offs have either been semi-Pelagian or just full-blown Pelagianism, and some different, and obviously semi-Pelagianism is that it originates in the theology of the French medieval theologian John Cassian, but basically the belief that there's a part of the human that isn't depraved, and therefore that one part of us that's not fallen could take the first step towards God, and then the grace of God kind of meets us the rest of the way. Unfortunately, a lot of what's called Arminianism or Wesleyanism ends up going they become semi-Pelagian, and we would say that as soon as someone is semi-Pelagian, then they're not properly a classical Wesleyan Arminian. But like some of the names would be like traditionalism within the Baptist camp, represented by Leighton Flowers. A lot of people think that just because Leighton Flowers isn't a Calvinist, then he's automatically an Arminian, and that's one of the things that really annoys us a lot, is that it's just because you're not a Calvinist doesn't mean you're an Arminian. To be an Arminian, you have to actually hold to the theology of Arminius. But so that would be one. Another one would be open theism. Open theism is not Arminian either. Actually, our favorite Wesleyan Arminian theologian Thomas Oden said that open theism is heresy, and we would agree with him on that. So yeah, those would be some. I don't know, Ben. What are some other ones?
Well, we guess we can point back. I mentioned like Charles Finney before.
Mhm.
Charles Finney, there was, kind of a whole movement that kind of extended off from him. Also from it was a, I don't know how to describe her, but she was a woman named Phoebe Palmer. They were kind of like the founders of what would be known as the American Holiness Movement, which was another, branch. I'm doing quotations, branch. You can't see them. Branch of our, of supposed like Wesleyanism. But again, that was like, semi, if not full blown Pelagianism. Like it became very, it was classified under, Arminianism or Wesleyan Arminianism, but it was very much its own entity and its own animal altogether, because of its essentially full emphasis on the will of men and its lack of emphasis on the grace of God. So that's, and that one is pretty common, because if you trace, you trace like their theology, and you can trace it right up through, like the Church of the Nazarene, things and groups like that still exist today. A lot of them were birthed from some of that theology, and some of their more earlier, like the earlier expressions of some of those churches and groups were very steeped in that kind of stuff. They've, amended a lot of that over the years, for the most part. But, a lot of them are very, a lot of like churches like this was like in the Midwest area still, struggle with a lot of that kind of stuff. But it's, that's another, I guess, classic portion of our, of I don't want to, I do my quotes again. I keep doing them underneath my desk here, but, another group in our world that kind of moves off of a more an orthodox expression of Wesleyan Arminianism.
Yeah. Going back to what Vin said, I've seen, latent flowers and open theists basically being equated with Arminian theology. And so as soon as you said that, I was wondering if that was something that was going to come up. I was curious about that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of one of those things that there's so many people out there that claim to be Arminian or Wesleyan, but their beliefs are in direct contradiction to the writings and thought of Arminius and Wesley.
Yeah.
That would be like somebody claiming that they're a Calvinist, but they're actually secretly a Universalist. Yeah. I mean,
right.
Like that doesn't make any sense. It's like, if you're a Calvinist, you're a Calvinist. If you're an Arminian, you're Arminian. You can't just, it's not like a one or the other kind of a thing. But unfortunately, that's what happens a lot. It's like, you're not a Calvinist. Oh, then you're an Arminian. And the person doesn't hold to any of the major tenets of Arminianism. But it's just kind of like a blanket categorization. As unfortunately it has been historically too, because I mean, even during John Wesley's day in the 18th century Britain, there were a lot of churchmen in England that claimed to be Arminian, but really what it was just a blanket term for theological liberalism. It was a mixture of like Socinianism and other Trinity denying beliefs, Arianism. But then Wesley comes along and he actually learns about the theology of Jacob Arminius himself, and he begins to preach a full-blown evangelical Arminianism that was true to the actual theology of Arminius. And in a lot of ways, Wesley was more opposed by what was called anyway Arminianism of his day than he even was to by the Calvinists of his day, in terms of his theological debates.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point. If you start doing what people generally do, then these categories become completely arbitrary. You can just call anything you want. And
yeah.
And for the flip side, if someone calls me a hyper Calvinist, I'm gonna be like, no, stop, please, because it gets really frustrating.
Yeah.
So one additional kind of off the cuff question that I had was about the Synod of Dort, right? That comes up a lot. And from y'all's perspective, did they properly represent Arminius? I could see that.
Well, he wasn't really represented at all, unfortunately.
Okay. So I guess would you speak to that a little bit for the sake of all of those who, I mean, Robert Godfrey wrote a book on the topic. I don't know if y'all read that.
Yes.
I can't remember what it was called. And if you read that, then you're just like, oh yeah, this was a perfect refutation of Arminius. But
yeah.
how would you address that?
Well, first of all, we have to take a step back and acknowledge that the Synod of Dort actually took place 10 years after Arminius died. Also, the whole Arminian Calvinist debate, which at the time was known as because Arminius's chief opponent at the University of Leiden was a professor by the name of Franciscus Gomarus. So it became an Arminius versus Gomarus debate. And Franciscus Gomarus was a supralapsarian. So a lot of the debate surrounded the two of them. But like I said, Arminius died, and then in the 10 years between the death of Arminius and the actual Synod of Dort, there was already there was a lot of pamphlet wars that broke out between the supporters of Arminius and the supporters of Gomarus's theology, and it became very political too. And it kind of became the Dutch merchant class, and those that supported the Estates General, signed with Arminius's theology, and those that supported Maurice of Nassau, or the Prince of the Netherlands were more Calvinist. So it really became like a political thing. And then there was over exaggeration on both sides. So that really, by the time you actually get to the Synod of Dort, the Arminianism that was on trial was really like already a changed Arminianism from the actual thought of Arminius himself. Right. And then what happened was basically when the Remonstrance, because the group of the Arminians came together and they wrote a document known as the Remonstrance of 1609. They came up with 5 points, and that was the 5 points of the Remonstrance. And then by the time they came to the Synod of Dort, they weren't really even given an opportunity at all to share their theological opinions. They were basically put at a middle table, and they were essentially considered almost guilty before even having an opportunity to even say much of anything at all. The trial was essentially like already done. And then obviously at the Synod of Dort, the 5 points of Calvinism are a reaction to the 5 points of the Remonstrance. So I don't know. I know Ben and I did an episode about that, and we talked about sitting at the middle table. Remember that, Ben?
Yeah.
Just kind of, it was basically the trial had already happened before the Remonstrance even came, in a lot of ways. So we would say that it wasn't really fair.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you explaining that. And it's always like those types of, situations and circumstances are always more complex than people want to chalk them up to be. They always want to just narrow it down and make it simplistic. So I guess as we kind of close out, if someone was interested in learning more about your position, what books, resources, stuff like that would you recommend?
Oh, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess from a
then I'll kick a couple in too.
Okay, all right. I think the best one-volume introduction to Arminius would be Jacob Arminius, Theologian of Grace by Keith Stanglin and Thomas McCall. That's the best one-volume introduction to Arminius. And then I would say if you're a Calvinist, I would recommend that book, because that would be, you'd learn a lot from that. And then also if you're a Calvinist and you want to learn about Wesley's theology, I would definitely recommend Fred Sanders' book, Wesley on the Christian Life, which is actually published by Crossway. That's a great one-volume introduction to Wesley. That would be that I believe that even even if you're a Calvinist that's not very favorable to Wesley, I think you would find that book encouraging, and you would at least walk away with a good understanding of who Wesley was, and you'll also see that he's really not who you might have heard he was. So,
right, yeah, and then we mentioned one at the beginning, Olson's book, which one you were thinking back in reference to, Arminian Theology, Myths and Realities. That was a book that Vin and I both started with. Feels like many years ago now, but maybe not as many as we think. But, it was a ways back, but that was a book that we both started on with our own, and it's just a good basic approach to, some classical positions and some misrepresentations. A lot of them are ones we deal with on the podcast, but he just kind of spells them out there well. And, we always throw a plug in for everything Thomas Oden, but that's for the one that's looking for some more, some deeper answers. But we love Oden. He has a 4-volume set on the theology of John Wesley. That's it's a masterpiece, and it's a needed thing, because it's, if you do have questions about Wesley, and you can go to, books by Sanders and Kenneth J. Collins, but if you're looking for more answers right from the source, it's hard to track them down, because Wesley, he didn't write a systematic theology, and he never claimed to be a theologian, but Oden has pulled together like all of his sermons and really done a tremendous work to give us positions on Wesley in a nice 4-volume set. So
awesome. Yeah, I've seen a lot of Oden's stuff like online. Like, he has his Systematic of the Early Church. I've been wanting to pick it up for a while. And Fred Sanders is awesome. I have his book on the Trinity. I really enjoy it. So those are all, I'll try to link those in the description for people who are listening. Where can people find you? What links would you give people to find your podcast and dive more into all this?
Yeah, so our website, we're at remonstrancepodcast.com. That's our main hub there. In terms of our podcast, we're on Stitcher. We're also on Apple Podcasts. And in terms of social networking, we're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook as well. And so you just look for Remonstrance Podcast on any of those places, and you'll find us there.
Awesome. And before we close out, do you guys have any closing thoughts or anything you want to share with listeners?
I think it's worth saying we appreciate the opportunity to have a good conversation about where our minds are and what we believe theologically. So we appreciate you inviting us on here for sure.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm one of those people that if curiosity killed the cat, I'm next. So it's one of those things. So it's been great having you guys on. I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having us on. I mean, our podcast is we're not polemical. Our goal is not to debate. We don't want to make this like an Arminian versus Calvinist thing. Our goal is really just to inform people what classical Wesleyanism and Arminianism is. That's really our purpose, and also to bring out some of the great strengths of it as a theological movement. I know that one thing that Ben and I talk about is how the Wesleyan Arminian tradition has really emphasized an optimism of grace, and how it doesn't put limits on what the power of grace could do in the life of the Christian. And that's just a really encouraging strength of the Wesleyan Arminian tradition. And we long for a day that more Calvinists and Wesleyan Arminians could discuss different theological topics as brothers, and we can learn more from each other and the strengths of each of our traditions. And that's really what we're trying to do with Remonstrance.
Really appreciate that. Yeah, that's really important. Especially today, like with everyone diving off into heresy everywhere else. This is not the time to start dividing over the things that they matter, but not as important, obviously. So,
yeah,
right. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you again. You guys are a delight to talk to, so I really appreciate it. Really knowledgeable.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Nick.
Thanks,
we really
appreciate it, Nick.
Yeah, of course. It was my pleasure. So that was Vin and Ben. Go check out their podcast. Links in the description. I hope that this was edifying. I hope it gave you a better insight into their position. I hope it led you to properly represent their position, because that's been a big thing for me in terms of Arminianism. And so there it is. They're really nice guys. We talked a little bit after the show, and I just really appreciated them. And they definitely do quality work on their podcast. They're very thorough, and I think you can kind of pick that up in this episode. So anyway, that's it. God bless you all, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.